My name is Jerry Barrett, and most of the people watching this probably know who I am. That's not a big surprise. I'm currently living in Seymour, Tennessee, which is a bit southeast of where Knoxville is, and have been here since 2017. My career with sleep medicine started in 1996, and it continued on through the first half of 2017. Throughout that time, I want to recognize all the people who served as president, all the doctors who served as president of the Academy while I was there. And the Academy and its membership were blessed with some terrific people. They were all smart, they were all dedicated, they were all hardworking, and they were all committed to the success of sleep medicine, both clinical, academic, and research. So it's not often that you have that type of a situation in association management, but I was fortunate to have it. In addition to that, though, we had terrific board members. So a lot of the people who did a lot of the heavy lifting never made it to be president, but their contributions were terrific and much needed, and their insights were exceedingly valuable, but they're often forgot about because they didn't reach the level of president. And I think that they need to be recognized. I also was very fortunate to have a terrific staff, and one that was hardworking and one that was willing to learn and do everything that was necessary to do to make the organization as successful as it was. So my role is I was the executive director, and I assumed that role right from the start. Prior to the Academy, and how did I get to the Academy? So I actually worked with the General Medical Society, the Chicago Medical Society, obviously in Chicago. The Chicago Medical Society was the 10th largest general medical society in the country. And back then, so I went to work for them in 1980. But fast forward up to 1995, and general medical societies dictated what happened in medicine at that time. State societies and large counties. And the large counties were essentially LA and Chicago. Those were the two biggest. They were considered the same size as states. So it was a big society. It had 6 times the membership of the Academy, okay? And it had 20 times the wealth of the Academy. So people say, why would you leave that? Okay, so that you can come to sleep medicine. And there's a good reason for that. And it was, people have heard me say, it was done with malice aforethought. Okay, one of my more common sayings. So I knew what I was doing. If you back the clock up to about 1992, the surgical societies split away from the AMA. The AMA at that time dictated the reimbursement schedules for all of the different specialties. And surgery always felt that they were being cheated or not viewed as well as they should be and reimbursed accordingly. So at an AMA meeting in 1992, the surgical societies separated from the AMA, okay? And they said, we're going to go to the government and we're now going to take on negotiating for our own fee schedule, and we're not letting the AMA represent us in that setting anymore. That was enormous shock went through the field at that time. And people couldn't believe what they were hearing. But over the next 4 years, all of the specialty societies began to do the same thing. So in a matter of time, you could see that the AMA was losing its grip on how the Medicare pie was going to be divvied up to the various specialty societies. And so general medical societies at that point lost their value and lost their importance, and they were going to go away. So the numbers that I talked about, the membership numbers and the financial position of the society, were going to be on a decline, and they were going to start pretty soon. So if your career was going to be in medical society management, you needed to move to the specialty societies. And that's where I was in 1995. And along came the sleep. The American Sleep Disorders Association was looking for an executive director. And I thought, what the heck? Let me see what's in this thing and see what it's all about. And so I actually sent in a letter of interest about my interest in the academy. And it was just within a couple of weeks, I got a phone call that said, geez, we like what you got and we want to meet with you. So there was some other, information that had to go along with that. But essentially, they had a big search committee. And it was kind of unusual for me because it was more than just the academy on the search committee. They had the SRS on the search committee. And the person who was the representative of the SRS was a doctor by the name of Chris Gillen. And Chris was from San Diego. And unfortunately, a few years later, he became pretty ill and he passed away. But he was quite the guy. And he was an interesting guy, but he was also very committed to sleep research and sleep medicine. And he and David White, who was the incoming president of the academy, and David will talk about in some detail here in a minute, but they knew that if sleep was going to survive, they needed to get somebody into the academy, into the organization that had a background in management and had a background in how all this stuff worked. And so I went to the search committee, and it was very interesting. It was in Chicago. It was at the O'Hare Airport Hilton. It was down in the dungeon basement down there, and there was a lot of people in that room. And this committee meeting went on, and the one thing that became clear in that meeting to me is nobody could agree on anything. Every time an idea came up, every time a question came up, there were 5 people that had something to say of why it shouldn't happen. I don't care who said it; didn't matter. And so there was complete. There was no continuity to the entire process down there. So finally, and they were not really asking me questions about my background. They were asking me questions about, would I merge the ASDA and the SRS into a single society, and if I did that, what would it look like? And I said, I have no idea. I don't know anything about either organization. So, we can't really do that. But that was the genesis of the organization. So we finally, got into some of the background. And that meeting went on for a while. And it didn't end up really in anything other than the standard "we'll get back to you" business. But what was clear is there was no set agenda on what they wanted. They really weren't sure of who they were looking for or what they were looking for, at least in my opinion. And after that meeting, I got some follow-up phone calls from David White and had more of an interview on the phone with him about what really happens in a medical society. How does this really work? And what is your vision of all of this? And David said to me, this is something that, and you need to know, he told me this, he said, you need to know this because this is going to be the last chance of us trying to make something out of this. So if you can make this work, great. And if you can't, then we're going to shut the doors and go turn to the ATS or the ACCP and, sleep will move on in a different direction. And so we talked about it, and I laid out for him the steps that needed to be taken if you really wanted to get your name in front of everybody. And they knew some of them, so they weren't completely oblivious to this stuff. And one of them was that you needed to have recognition by somebody other than yourself. And sleep didn't have that. Sleep at that time, no sleep at that time was more of a macho thing. I stayed up for 3 days and worked, and that was that was the thing. And so anybody that went to sleep was kind of laughed at back then, as being some kind of wuss. And the best example of that were residents. Okay, like you need to work for like 5 days straight, and if you can do that, then we'll think about letting you into the surgery thing. And it's like, okay, but I don't know that I want somebody that's been up 5 days straight operating on me, But anyway, that was the mindset, and all the doctors knew it. They worked these guys to death, and it was the accepted route to get to wherever they wanted to go in medicine. But at any rate, sleep needed recognition, so they needed to get into the AMA at the time. They also needed to become the group that sanctioned their own CME. So there's a group out there called ACCME, it's the American Council for Medical Education. And so for doctors, when you hold a conference, you award CME, and they need the CME hours for licensure, okay, and hospital privileges and that sort of thing. And so it's important of who's the group that actually awards the CME. It doesn't sound like much, but it's a bigger deal than most people realize. At the time, the ASDA, which was the group's name, used to have to go out and get another company to do it. They're private companies that do this, and that was never really had a good look. And the other thing was the name. So they were the American Sleep Disorders Association. Everybody thought they were a patient group. Okay, nobody in medicine looked at the ASDA as a group of medical doctors, okay, treating any kind of serious illness or any illness whatsoever. They just thought they were a patient group. And I told David that. Later on, we'll get that in a minute, but I told the whole board that at some point, or later on. Anyway, so we went through that, and then we went through, you have to have training programs. And the best I can tell, you don't have that. You don't have any set, coordinated, standardized training for people in sleep medicine. And so you just go to pulmonary medicine, or you go to neurology, or you go to pediatrics, or whatever you go to, and then you take an interest in sleep medicine, go to a meeting, and you're good to go. And I said, that's me as an outsider. And I wasn't that far off. And I said, you need to have some standardized training, okay? Everybody needs to practice sleep medicine in not exactly the same way. We don't believe in cookbook medicine, but you do believe that there has to be some basic standards, and you don't have those. And of course, they were just very lightly touching on developing standards of practice and that sort of thing. And once you get all that stuff, then you can start talking about going after a board certification and whatnot. But the other thing is that you didn't have enough numbers. There was no critical mass of sleep doctors out there to treat people. And chasing after all of these things with a small membership, and I think the membership at that time was right around 2,000 people, okay? And that's just not enough to make an impression on anybody at that point in time. He didn't have anything else, and I told David that. And so we had several conversations about that. And then, so the first meeting was in February, and then in March, they got a hold of me and said, well, we'd like you to come, and we're having a board meeting in Arizona. This is another committee meeting, and in between then, they said, we'd like you to go to Rochester, which is where the headquarters was. I lived in Chicago. The organization was headquartered in Rochester, Minnesota. And so I went up there to look at the office and talk to the people and, looked around Rochester and that sort of thing. And so I had a feel for it. I had also asked them for some information, okay? And David he could not have been more pleased to give me what I was looking for. So I wanted bylaws and minutes and audit reports and financial reports and, all that sort of stuff. And actually paid a great deal of attention to all of that sort of stuff. But they gave me a really interesting document too. So they had the staff in Rochester at the time all write down what they were looking for in an executive director and what they expect. It's a priceless document. And I got all of this stuff. And it was clear that it was a ship without a rudder. It really was. And it wasn't really anybody's fault. Okay? Rochester, Minnesota at the time had two employers, Mayo and IBM. And everybody that lived in Rochester wanted to work for Mayo or IBM. All of the other businesses in Rochester, Minnesota had people in waiting to get hired. And that was a huge problem. So, and that comes up in a bit. And I wasn't, it wasn't unusual. And just as a funny story, I bought a house on the southeast side of Rochester when I went to work there. And my neighbor said to me, well, where do you practice at Mayo? I said, I don't practice at Mayo. And his response was, well, why are you living here? Which I thought was really hilarious, but telling. So Rochester was Mayo and it was IBM. And where I lived actually comes into play here in a little bit, but because there were a lot of side conversations from all the sleep doctors at Mayo. They had to pass my house to go anywhere. And if they saw me, they always stopped and had a conversation about it. But at any rate, let's move on to Arizona. And so we went to Arizona and had another meeting of the board. Now the full board is there. And we get into this interview, and we went through exactly what I just told you. The things that were going on. I talked about their financial statements. They had about just over $1 million, maybe $1.5 million was the total assets of the organization at that time. They had no computer systems in place. Okay, everything was still done manually. They had a couple of they had one computer, but it wasn't connected to anything. It didn't have any internet access. It wasn't wired to anybody. It was nothing. And so organizationally, from the staff standpoint, it needed a lot of help. Okay. And from the board standpoint, it needed a lot of help. And I was very clear about that when we went up there. And we had a very good conversation about research and all of the other things that go into what a medical society needs to be. And there's 3 things that any successful medical society has to have. It has to have a journal. It has to have a credible journal. It has to have a credible meeting, clinical, scientific, but it's got to be credible with like real education and not a lot of practice management stuff or insurance, none of that stuff. A real credible education meeting with it, and it's got to have the money to support those 2 things. Now, if you have those 3 things, you've got something to build on. If you don't have those 3 things, you're in trouble. And honestly, at that point in time, they had a journal, but it was in serious trouble. It got published like twice or two or 3 times a year. It got published, and within succession, within like weeks, you would get 3 or 4 issues, and then you wouldn't see anything for months on end, and then you get 2 more. And it went like that, and you had a meeting that was struggling. And it was struggling because it was dominated with research. Okay, and it was dominated with basic research, which most clinicians have a passing mild interest in, but nothing that they're going to jump up and down for. And these 2, so the meeting and the journal are actually controlled by another organization that was half owned by the then ASDA and half owned by the SRS. And it was not being managed as well as it should be managed. And what I mean by that is the SRS people, they wanted control of the journal for scientific reasons. They could get their papers published, and they wanted control of the meeting because, their careers were more influenced by speaking at a meeting, getting a paper published than the clinical people. So they needed to have control of that, and they were fearful that if the academy got its hands on it, that the research end of it would go away. David never felt that way. Most of that board never felt that way, but the SRS leadership at that time did feel that way. And they knew that. But those things needed to get fixed if you had any hopes of anything ever going on. And we talked about all of that and how to move the organization, where to go. They asked me they said, well, if you're going to go to Rochester, if we hire you, and they said, how many of these people do you think that work there now are going to stay with the company? And I said, none. And they were stunned. They said, what do you mean none? I said, none. They said, you're going to fire them? I said, no, I'm not going to fire anybody. I said, they're all going to quit. And I said, they're not used to somebody like me. They worked for somebody who her heart was in the right place and she wanted to do the right thing, but she didn't have any experience at it. And she tried to do the right thing. Okay. So there's no malice in any of that. But they took the organization as far as they could take it, and they didn't know what to do from that point on. And when people got there, I was a shock, trust me. So anyway, we talked for a couple of hours, and you get the old, well, we're going to get back to you. And I said, nah, that's not how this is going to work. We're not going to do that. I said, right now whether you want me or you don't want me. Okay, so I said, I'm going to take 15 minutes and I'm going to walk out the door. And you think about this and you get a hold of me and tell me one way or the other, because I've been doing this since January. We're now into March, and and I'm okay whichever way you decide to go. And they were kind of stunned that I was, and I got up and walked out of the room. I said, come and get me in 15 minutes. So they actually came back in 15 minutes, and they brought me back in the room, and they said, and now you got to remember, at that time, June Fry was actually the president. David was the president-elect, and June Fry was the nicest lady you ever wanted to meet, but not an aggressive person, okay? But she was very quiet and nicest lady you ever wanted to be around. So they called me back in and they said, okay, we want you. And, so Milt Ehrman was the secretary treasurer at the time, the treasurer. And they said, Milt came up with a number that we want to pay you. And he slid a piece of paper across the table to me, and I looked at it, and I took out a pen and I erased it, and I put another number on it, and I slid it back over to the table, and they were all in shock. They said, well, we've never paid anybody like that this much money before. And I said, well, you've never hired anybody like me before. And they were just stunned. And Gillen was I'm pretty sure Chris Gillen was at this meeting. And they were like, oh my goodness, I mean, this is like, we don't have money to do this. And they argued about it for about 10 minutes, maybe longer. And finally, David White stood up and said, stop. Just pay this guy, okay? Pay him, because he's got to make the money. And if he doesn't make the money, he doesn't get paid. We shut the doors and we go on to plan B. And so they said yes, and then that was that. Before I left Arizona, Paul Fredrickson, we were waiting outside the hotel. And Paul Fredrickson was a past president. He had been, he was still on the board, so he was the past president when Cater was the president. So he was rotating off. This would have been probably his last meeting. And Paul Fredrickson was a Mayo guy. Okay, and Mayo guys and IBM guys you couldn't distinguish between them at the time. They were all tall, lean, blue suits, white shirts, dark ties, and quiet, and off they went. And we're standing out in front of this hotel waiting for a car to take us to the airport, and he looked at me and he said, I sure hope you know what you're doing and what you're getting into. And I told him, I said, don't worry about it, I'll be okay. We'll be just fine, okay? And he said, I sure hope so. He says, I like you, but are you sure you know what you're doing? I said, positive, don't worry about it. And then he and I became really pretty close friends after that meeting. And that ended the meeting. But from that point on, now I still worked in Chicago. And I had a contract, and I needed a 90-day buyout of that contract, okay? And they were having a lot of difficulty in Chicago, and the last thing they wanted me to do was leave. They were not happy about that. But they understood, okay? So, but David, if you know David White, anybody that knows him knows that the minute he gets something he wants, he's gonna run with it, okay? And he only runs at one speed, okay? And that's as fast as he can go. So David and I started having all these conversations. So between about April 1st, okay, and the meeting, and actually in July 1st, but up to the meeting, which was in June, we were on the phone constantly. So I was working for the academy, for the medical society in Chicago, and of course you had a staff that was, as nervous as could be, because, a Chicago person going to Rochester was their worst nightmare. Okay, it really was one of those Chicago people, and back then, I mean, one cultural thing that was in place back then is that was when you still wore a shirt and a tie and a jacket to work every day, okay? And when I went up there and looked, I mean, these people were in sweatpants and sweatshirts, and they introduced the casual dress code to the workplace 10 years before the rest of the world dialed into it. So they were visionary in that respect. And after I had gotten hired, I said, enjoy all this, because the day I get there, that all changes, and here's the dress code. But at any rate, so we had all these discussions and whatnot, and I actually went to the meeting in June, okay? I think maybe it might have been late May, but it was anyway. The meeting was in Washington, D.C. And that really sets the stage for where we're at. It's my first experience with the sleep meeting. And at the time, the sleep meeting had clinical courses on a Thursday and a Friday. And then on Saturday, the actual scientific part of the meeting started. So there were a lot of scientific presentations. There were some clinical presentations and whatnot. And a lot of other stuff went on. And I came in on a Friday night. And again, everybody who knows me and travel do not mix. Do not travel with me because it's a disaster. It just is. And it took me, I think, about 15 hours to fly from O'Hare Airport to actually get to a hotel in Washington, D.C. I could have driven it quicker, and I've driven it many times quicker. And then I got there about 4 o'clock in the morning, okay, on Saturday morning, and ended up Saturday morning and ready to work in about 2 hours later. And so the meeting over the weekend had a number of things. Of course, David's running around introducing me to everybody. And there were a couple of things that happened. There were several board meetings that were unplanned that actually took place at that thing, and they're significant. One of them, the most significant thing that happened is on Monday morning, there was a National Sleep Foundation was having they were a different organization, and they were more public awareness-minded group of people. So they had doctors and researchers and patients. So they were a conglomerate of all sorts of things. And they were going to have a rally on Capitol Hill on a Monday morning. And so the board said to me, like, what do you think about that? And I said, not much. I said, I don't know what they're doing. I don't know what their message is. But as a general rule, if you want to make friends in Congress, they don't like people picketing their office. That's not the best way, to get your introduction. And they said, no. So come on with us. And we went to some other hotel. And this is Bill Dement. And he's in there with some one of the lobbyist guys that they had, and they have all these patients in there, and they're all riled up, and they have all these signs and whatnot, and they're going to march on Capitol Hill. And on these signs, they're accusing Congress people of being murderers of American citizens. You're killing American citizens because you're not funding sleep research. That was their message. So they all pile into buses, and I said, don't do that. Don't. And I'm telling White this. And I said, okay, good luck with this. So they all jump into buses, and they go down, and they march on Capitol Hill. And later in the afternoon, this is early in the morning, later in the afternoon, Claude L'Enfant, who was the director of the NHLBI and in charge of sleep research, calls up David White. And he wants a meeting with the board immediately, that night. Okay? And so David puts the meeting together and gets all the SRS players in there, and he gets the sleep people, the academy people in there, and L'Enfant reads them the riot act. Where do you people get off? And he just went crazy on him in there. It was pretty entertaining, actually. And as it turns out, okay, he said, you will never get anything from me. Okay, I'm getting rousted and blah, 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 blah. And it goes on and on and on. And the meeting ends. Okay, and everybody's just sitting there stunned at what happened. And there wasn't any I told you so's, but they got the picture of, even the people going to Congress is fine. When you start accusing people of, being responsible for the death of other people, that's a line that even back then you couldn't cross, much less, today, modern day today. So anyway, so that was one of the things that went on. And there was controversy at that meeting concerning the journal. So again, now we have some meeting things going on, and we have a journal going on. And the journal David knew that the editor of the journal needed to change. The guy that was the editor, Christian Guilleminault, had been the only editor, or had been the editor of that journal for as long as anybody could remember, okay? And the journal was actually being managed at Stanford. He was from Stanford, and they had a contract that they paid Stanford to manage the journal. And the journal was losing money like crazy, and the publications of the journal were not coming out with any regularity whatsoever, and it had no impact factor at all. None. Zero impact factor. And in research, a zero impact factor is death. You can't put a paper in a journal that doesn't have some credibility in the scientific world. And so David knew that needed to change, and that editor needed to go. And there were a series of conversations that occurred at that meeting, okay, about that very thing. And the people, everybody was uncomfortable with doing it. You have to understand, everybody were very nice people. And this was a small group of people that started all of this. And they had been together for a very long time, and they knew each other, and they liked each other, and they traveled back and forth to their various universities and gave talks. And David White could care less about any of that. He needed a journal. The other part of the journal are meeting abstracts. And the meeting abstracts at the time weren't published by the journal that was owned by the two societies. They had a contract with another company, something I think was like Brain Research Company, or I'm not sure if that's the exact name. And it was a member of the SRS who had influence with that, and they published the abstracts in this Brain Research, and then they turned around and they sold the abstract book to the members, okay? And part of membership of the SRS is that you had to buy that thing, and then the Academy was just charged, if you want the abstract book, you had to pay this price to get it up and above, I think it was like $45. And you had to pay that, and they didn't want it. So David he said, this is the last meeting. We're not going to own the abstract. This is it, okay? We have to own that material. We have to have the rights to that material. It's got to get published, and the abstracts have to become part of the meeting, which they weren't. They were just published. They didn't have posters or any of the rest of that stuff at the time, or they had very few of them. And so he insisted that change. So the bottom line is that there was a decision at that meeting that the editor needed to change. And they were going to start that at that point. And David went to Guilleminault and laid it out for him and said, you can resign, or we're going to terminate your contract. That's in essence what happened. And he elected then to say, all right, I'll step aside. He knew that there was a lot of pressure on him. But he said, that the journal is still being managed at Stanford, and they know how to do journals, and they're Stanford, and blah blah blah. I said, well, we'll deal with that in a bit. And so we'll come back to Stanford. But so that started off a new search committee. At the same meeting, there was another one of these, 8:00 at night emergency meetings, but this time it was an APSS thing, because there was the guy that published the abstracts. His name was Michael Chase. And Michael Chase was, he was from Los Angeles, okay, UCLA. And very smart guy, okay? And he was a guy that he had a vision. And his vision was that online publications were the thing. And start investing in online publications, because that's the way of the future. Now, in 1996, nobody believed that, okay? But Michael Chase believed that. And he came to this board and he said, I'm starting an online sleep review, Sleep Research Online. I think that was the name of his journal, Sleep Research Online. And everybody about lost their mind, okay? I mean, really, they thought, we got competition. We're struggling with sleep as it is, and we need to get a new editor, and now you're coming and doing this, and why are you doing this? And this discussion went on. There was outrage. People were yelling and screaming across the table. It was pretty amazing, actually. And after about I don't know, 45 minutes or an hour. They finally turned to me and they said, well, what do you think? You're the new executive director. What do you weigh in on this? And I said, I'm a free enterprise guy. I said, let him go. I don't care. I don't think he's not going to be in my way. All right. Or in your way. So what do you care? I don't understand this. Let him, he's going to publish it online. You've got another journal. You just have to publish a better journal than he does. That's all. It's that simple. So I don't really care. At that moment, there was Tom Roth became my best friend. Okay. Because he was caught, there was a guy by the name of Tom Roth. Okay. And again, most of the people listening to this are going to know who he is. He was an exceedingly influential guy in both the SRS and the Academy. He had been president of both. And Roth is a guy from Michigan and very smart, very political, very entertaining speaker, and a guy everybody loved, even if they didn't like him, they loved him. Okay. And he had a lot of influence, and he was just a nice guy. So anyway, and he was a friend of Michael Chase's and a lot of other people that were influential in the societies back then. And they didn't want to have to vote against Michael. They just didn't. And I gave him the out. I didn't realize it at the time, but I gave him the out saying, go let him publish it. I don't, whatever. And so they did. And they never regretted doing it. So they avoided a conflict and ended up then forming a search committee so they could replace the journal editor. And that's a process that took about a year. And so in a little bit, we'll get there, but we'll get to San Francisco, which is where the meeting was the following year, and away we go. There's also another group of people that had to be dealt with as a regular part, not dealt with, but we had to work with them. And they were technologists that worked in sleep labs. And as I said, David White's coming in as president, but his head tech was coming in as president of the polysomnography group, they were called at the time. But they were the technologists. And David, had a good relationship with this guy, only David was leaving. So he was leaving and moving to Boston. So this guy didn't have anything to lose to get into a fight with David White at this meeting, because after this, he wasn't going to see him again. So we went to a board meeting of the technologists, and this guy gets up and he just starts ranting and raving, and doctors are this and doctors are that and doctors the other thing, and this is all going to change, and we got a bigger stake in this, and on and on and on and on and on he goes. And he is just giving a really loud, hard lecture to a handful of doctors. That I was there, White was there, the executive committee of this, Schmidt and Warr was there. And they finally, after a while, they turned to me and they said, what do you think? And I said, I don't think we have any business in this meeting. His mind's made up. So I said, it's up to me. I think we should leave. And they all got up and left. They just left, and we didn't even respond. I said, well, if that's the way you feel, we're happy to know it. So you had all of these, the point of these stories is that you had a lot of there were a lot of hard feelings around by a lot of people that needed to be mended. And it goes back to what I said in that meeting that I had in February in Chicago. This place lacked leadership. Nobody was in charge, okay? And because nobody was in charge, everybody was going in a completely different direction, and that needed to change. And White was going to change it, and I was going to change it. And if nothing else was clear at the end of that meeting, business as usual at the Academy, okay, had come to an end. And I'm not sure everybody was going to like what followed, but what followed. And that's where that ended. So you had the organizations were the ASDA, the Sleep Research Society, the Associated Professional Sleep Societies. So those were the three that were the most tied together. Then there was the technologists that were there, and actually they were actually part of APSS at one time, and got mad and quit. So they were out and never let back in. But anyway, so you had that group was there. Then you had the NSF. So you had a National Sleep Foundation, which was actually funded by the Academy. They gave them the money, but then they ended up out there kind of competing or trying to compete or interfering in things that they really shouldn't have. Nobody had a clear direction of where they were going. And so you had that, and then you had there was a sleep apnea group, there was patient groups. There was a sleep apnea group, there was a restless leg group, there was a narcolepsy group. So I had all these little patient organizations. And they all felt that they had equal standing with the then ASDA. All of that was in play, and they all wanted to be funded by the doctors, the ASDA. And they were all coming with hat in hand, but their agendas were important, and they needed board people to be on their boards, and they wanted a greater role in actually practicing medicine. And see, that's the crazy thing about patient organizations, and this is true throughout. The patients then want to become practitioners, okay? And that is the single greatest danger with patient groups, okay? Is we know better than the doctors know, and they need to agree with us that we know that. And that's just true throughout, because the people that get involved in these things are passionate, very passionate. The average John Doe does not get involved in an organization unless they've been impacted by a family. So somebody gets killed by a drunk driver, and the outrage of the parents of that child that was killed by that drunk driver, they start organizations, and that becomes their life. And so they're zealots, okay, in these patient organizations, and very difficult to deal with. And they just. So anyway, that was the organization field. The population didn't know anything about sleep medicine, okay? And again, everybody felt that not sleeping was some sign of strength, okay? And, if you could go 2 days without sleep, you were tougher than the guy next to you that needed to get 8 hours of sleep a night. And that was the perception. And people insomnia was not something that was talked about. Snoring, well, everybody snored. Everybody smoked. Everybody did everything wrong, okay? And they were all sick, and they didn't realize that sleep had the impact that it has. And there wasn't a coordinated strategy out there to try to tell people, okay? And the other thing, and this is a problem that plagued and probably plagues sleep medicine to this day, and that is that the concentration of caregivers are in large metropolitan areas. So there's not a distribution of sleep doctors across the country to meet the needs of the population. And everybody knows that patients will travel about 50 miles to see a doctor, but not much more than that, okay? And that was back then. I don't know, they probably would travel a little bit further now, depending on where you're at, but the circumstances now are all different. But back then, and so people couldn't get the sleep doctors. Within this, and so getting the word out to patients like, this is really something you need to deal with. But aside from that, doctors didn't know about sleep medicine. The only people that knew about sleep medicine was this handful of people. I told you there's 2,000 people, okay, that are members of the academy at that time, right around 2000. You had, most of them were doctors, and you had a contingent of PhDs, okay, who worked in sleep labs or worked in behavioral sleep medicines, insomnias, all sorts of other things. And there was no regulation of sleep labs. There was no licensure of technologists. There was no standardized education for anybody, okay? And so that's really what we were facing, okay? And then it became, how do you deal with that? After the meeting, the sleep meeting, in June every year, there was an AMA meeting. It was their annual meeting. And this year, this particular year, 1996, there's a committee at the AMA that reviews applications for recognition into their House of Delegates. Okay? And ASDA had been trying to gain a seat and representation in that House for a while, and they had been unsuccessful at it, or more or less they were kind of stumbling around, and nobody really helped them. The AMA is not very helpful. They were not very helpful in how to do this. Okay, but they also saw the influence of the specialty societies. They have a special group within the AMA. They had it at that time, a special group that was just specialty society representation, and they weren't really in favor of getting that any bigger and stronger than it already was because of what the surgeons did 5 years earlier. But as it turns out, the guy who chaired the committee, his name was Dennis Brown, he was the doctor. He was actually the president and my boss at the Chicago Medical Society, okay? And he was chairing that committee. And he had himself in a little jam that I helped him out of. Now, this is a true story. So I said, all right, I'm going to help you out of this, but you got to get this group, you got to get your committee to approve membership of my group into this thing. And he said, okay, that's the deal. Okay, you help me do this, and then I'll take care of this thing for you. And I said, that's how it goes. Perfect. So along comes the AMA meeting. Now, I'm at the AMA meeting with my own organization. And so Paul Frederickson is there, and Andrew Jameson is there, who are going to be the AMA people from the sleep group, and Bill Dement. And Bill Dement, we're at this meeting, everything is going fine, and Bill Dement again comes in, he storms in the door, and he is just ranting and raving about you aren't paying attention to sleep, and it's a deadly disease, and he's going on and on and on. And everybody who knew Bill knew how passionate he was and how vocal he was with his passion about the importance of sleep. And he let these people know. They just kind of looked at me and said, you're going to go work for this group? I said, yeah, he's fine. Don't worry about it. I mean, he's a very passionate kind of guy. He very believes in it. And so at that meeting, we were the only group that got accepted that year into the House of Delegates. Okay, so you got a seat in the House of Delegates, which became Paul Frederickson. Now, Paul Frederickson, again, he was the past president, but he was absolutely the picture. When you looked up AMA delegate in the dictionary, there was Paul Frederick's face. Okay, this is it. White shirt, blue suit, dark tie, grayish hair, great guy. And so they got in. So that was really monumental as we move forward. David, of course, has David's now president. So I'm moving, he's moving, I'm moving. There's a board meeting in July. You kind of get everybody sort of reorganized at that board meeting and trying to get them focused on what they're going to do. And there's a lot of APSS business. So straightening out this organization that's half owned by researchers and clinicians, okay, is in process. And there comes a point where you find out that when you read the partnership, that it's being managed very differently than what the agreement said, okay? And people just didn't either pay attention to it or didn't read it or didn't realize it or whatever the reason, okay? And so the very first thing that happened is we needed to get that partnership to be a partnership. And what was really going on is that the SRS would schedule all these board meetings, okay, when doctors couldn't go. I mean, they knew you couldn't get away from patients at 2 p.m. and have a board meeting, but the researchers had, and so there was just over a meeting. This is what they fought over, everything. And so what it really came down to is that each group had 4 people that represented their group on a managing committee of the Associated Professional Sleep Societies. There again, the journal and the meeting. And they looked at it as being 8 votes. But when you looked at the partnership agreement, which is what I did, that's not what it says. There's one vote for each side. And that became, right after the meeting, right after I got there, in July and August, that was the crux of the issue. and it was, so I'm back to Tom Roth, took a look at that agreement, and the lawyers had looked at the agreement, and they all come up and they said, he's right. You get one vote. That's all you get. There's 2 votes in this thing, and everything is either unanimous or it doesn't work. And fighting, and Tom Roth finally stood up and he said, "This is it. He's right. This is the way this has to go, and we need to do this." And they did. So that's where the APSS fix began to actually occur, was right there. So now you could go off and caucus all you wanted with your other delegates, and you could have your own agendas, and you could bring stuff into the meeting. There's only 2 votes in the meeting, and that was the one thing that started to force people to learn to work together and to achieve some compromise. They had not had that. And again, I identified this in February, and now we're in July and August, and that's starting to happen. And it really was the thing that saved the meeting and the journal as they knew it then for the next 20 years. Okay. So that's a hugely critical piece. And then we kind of fast forward now into September, and you're getting into planning for the next year. And one of the things that was being planned is the sleep meeting, which was going to be in San Francisco the following June. So we're in September. And I go out to San Francisco, the program committee. Jerry Siegel and I did not get along at the first meeting. Okay, he was pretty insistent that he was going to run the entire meeting and I was a bystander. And I said, well, that's a nice story, but that's not how this is going to work. So we went to that meeting, and Siegel soon found out that if he just focused on the science and focused on speakers and focused on, then all of the rest of the stuff he didn't have to worry about. Okay, he and I actually became very close friends. Okay, to the point where his son actually worked for me one summer at an APSS meeting. After we got this APSS thing, then we needed to go to NIH and make peace with L'Enfant. Okay, and so David and I don't remember who else. There had to be some other people out there, but it was at least David and I went. But anyway, we went out to NIH, and L'Enfant was very gracious. He said, "You can come out, bring whoever you want, but don't bring Dement. He's not welcome in my office." So that, okay, just calm down. And so we went out and we met with him. He was a really nice guy, but boy, he was as straight-laced as they come. And he was very inquisitive about me. And he asked me, like, "Where are you from?" And I told him Chicago, and I was with the medical society there. He said, "Do you know a guy by the name of John Porter?" And I said, "Well, absolutely, I know John Porter. He was a congressman from Illinois. He was a Republican, one of the few Republicans from Illinois that was in Congress. He was a North Side guy, which even more rare. And from the medical society, we worked very closely with him. So whenever when you're in medical societies, you work very closely with congressmen or senators from your area, if there's stuff that you want or stuff that they want, and they want stuff as much as we do." And I said, "Yeah, I know him pretty well." I said, "I worked on his finance committee, yeah, I knew him." He said, "Well, he's the guy that runs the appropriations committee for NIH." And I said, "Yeah, I know that." And he said, "Well, you do any lobbying?" And I said, "I've been a registered lobbyist since 1985 or something. So, I lobby all the time." And he left it alone. Okay, and we had to finish the conversation, and whatever, and well, we don't have any money, and we have to take it from somebody else, and you guys got to do this, that, and you know the drill. You've been out there. And so we had a nice meeting with them, and everybody left shaking hands and happy and smiling and all the rest of this. A month later, I'm in San Francisco, and this phone call shows up at 4 a.m. from L'Enfant's office that said, "Is there any way you can come to Washington, D.C., okay, and meet with Dr. L'Enfant?" And I said, "Well, I'm in San Francisco right now. I don't know how fast I can get there." But I said, let me try. I'll call you back. And I actually called David. He was in Boston at this time. And he's like, what's going on? And I said, are you okay? And we going and visiting him, and he was okay with it. So I found a flight and booked a flight, and got there later in the evening I got a flight right away, and went out there, and L'Enfant wanted some help with Porter and his budget. And I said, okay, let me go talk to him. And so I went back in the left NIH, went down to the congressional building and went in and sat with Porter's people. Okay. And I said, what can you do? And they said, well, here's the thing. Congressmen never read appropriations bills. They just don't. They didn't read them then. They don't read them now. They're just more obvious with it now than they were then. So they asked me, they said, go back and ask him. He's going to testify in a couple of days. So go back and ask him to write out 10 questions that he wants us to ask him. Okay? And then you bring the questions back and give them to us. And I said, got it. And what they do is they distribute the questions to the Republicans who are sitting on the committee, or the Democrats, but in this case it was Republicans. They sent them out to their people, and they ask a very intelligent question about something very specific in the budget. It looks like they read it and that they know what they're talking about, okay? And that's what we did. So I went back, and he gave me them, and I put them on the 3x5 index cards, and went back into Porter's office and gave him the questions. And I went back to Minnesota, and the questions were asked, and the answers were made, and Claude got his stuff. And then that's when they got 10 Sleep Academic Awards, and all kinds of other goodies came as a result of that. We went back. We got called back out. We went back out to NIH, and L'Enfant was just as happy as could be, okay, with what happened, how that whole process had worked. And so then they had these, they were Sleep Academic Awards, and there were some other awards that they had given him. And that really kicked off the clinical research part, where he actually paid more attention than to sleep, because his budget was broader than just sleep, okay? But he was like I said, he was a very bright guy, okay? And the help that he asked for was not against the rule. He didn't do anything against the rules, okay? And actually, nobody did anything against the rules with that. That's the way the system worked, and it was all fine. But from that point forward, that was the drill that happened year after year after year until he retired, and I think it was Betsy Nabel then replaced him as the director sometime 10 years later, or 8 years later, some 2006 or something in that, 2005, somewhere in there, is when he retired, and she got replaced. So that relationship then got settled. Okay. The next things that came up were the name, and we were pretty insistent that this name thing had to change. And I made the case. You're viewed as a patient organization. You're not viewed as a real organization. And there was a lot of angst that was going on back then about what to do with that. You have to change your name. And I proposed the American Academy of Sleep Medicine. And they kicked around some other names, but it was the simplest of all, because when you looked at specialty societies, they were all the American Academy of something. So it only made sense that you would be sleep medicine. There was a lot of consternation about this PhD thing. It starts way back in the 1998, 1997, and what's the role of the PhDs in the sleep centers and all the rest of that business. And so eventually they got into this process of changing the name. The name change initiative started actually in late 1996, okay, but it actually was like 1999 before, because they ended up surveying the members and changing, and it was a long, drawn-out process. And part of that then became, and that actually happened. But what that did was set the stage to get a strategic direction where all the rest of these things could fall into place. Now, when we were talking about the conglomerate of organizations that were out there, the one obvious one that we did not talk about, and I need to add to the list, was the American Board of Sleep Medicine. And the American Board of Sleep Medicine was a self-designation certification board for sleep doctors. And that's an important, I can't believe we left that out, but that's a hugely important group of people. And the important part is that they're self-designated. So in clinical medicine, whenever a new clinical specialty starts up, all their boards are self-directed boards. And they try to mimic to the best they can the structure that's used by the American Board of Medical Specialists, which is the ultimate goal of where everybody wants to have their board exam and be recognized, because that really puts you on the map as the legitimate group that you are. You just need somebody else to recognize it. So you can be smart, but that piece of paper that says you have a degree from Harvard makes you that much smarter. And that's what this is. So anyway, you have the American Board of Sleep Medicine that's out there. And they wanted to start the process of trying to get official certification in sleep medicine, through the proper channels. Now, there's a process that goes on in order to do that, okay? And we talked about getting into the AMA. We talked about being your own CME accredited group. You need to do that, okay? And then you need to have training programs, and once the training programs are there, then you can go. You need to have a critical mass of people too. So you've got to get people that you have certified, and you have to have your exam straightened out so that it's correct, so that it meets what's happening. Now, back then, it was very archaic because everything was paper back then. The digital world had not hit sleep medicine in 1999. It wasn't even close, okay? And so these examinations were done by paper, all right? And they were scored by people who read, the answers were not yes and no or A, B, C, and D. They were written exams. So you wrote out your answer and literally wrote it out, okay? So you didn't have a word processor, and you didn't have any of that. And all of that stuff needed to change, but people are in these organizations, change is really something that does not swallow easily, okay? Because everybody finally gets into a position where they have some influence, and then here comes me that wants to change everything, and they see it as diminishing their influence. And in a way, they're correct. It does diminish their influence because everything needed to be brought in under the board of the academy, okay? You have to have one central leadership group, and it was the academy, and it became the American Academy of Sleep Medicine, which is how I'm going to refer to it from now on. So, and they needed to get a handle on all of these things because they were going to be the driving force behind it. But you needed to get the exam straightened out, and you needed to get it where it could be graded, okay? So everybody's scores are being looked at subjectively. And it wasn't. It was an objective test that was graded by whoever read the test, okay? Whoever scored the test because you read the answers to the test. It was a very convoluted system. And it was nothing like a test should be done. But again, it's easy to look back and make that statement, but you didn't have the digital equipment that you have now to do a test like that. So what I'm saying, they should have done, they couldn't have done, all right? But it was moving in that direction, and we needed to get it to move in that direction. And that was a hard thing, but we got it to move in that direction. And David was pretty instrumental. He actually went in, because he got involved in that after he, was through being president. But at any rate, so that's when that process started actually in 1999, and it didn't end again until in 2006, I think it was, when it finally ended. So we had those pieces now put together. And the training programs, as I said before, there was no standardized training in sleep medicine, and that had to change. So there was a president who came a couple of years down the road. His name was John Shepard. John Shepard was actually a Mayo guy. So we got Harvard and Mayo people all over the place. But there were others inside. There was others also. But John Shepard, and he was all into the training programs, the fellowship training programs that we had. But even then, standardizing the training was a problem, but you needed to do it, okay? And that was a hard task to get people to do that, to try to standardize this. And the other piece to standardizing training is what they call clinical practice guidelines, okay? And standards of practice papers. That's probably the more formal name. And what happens with that, and I know I'm crossing all over the place now, but these things all interrelate. So the Academy didn't have any clinical practice guidelines or standards of practice papers for sleep medicine. There was another president, his name was Andy Chesson, who was very much into that. But this is where the staff thing became a real problem, because there was nobody that understood what this process was, okay? And it was new in medicine. It had only been around about 10 years at that point in time, and specialty groups were all in the process now of creating, how do you practice sleep medicine, okay? And how does this all work? You have a clinical way to do it. There's a standard of practice that you have to decide, how are you going to treat this patient? And everybody needs to do it kind of the same way. What do all these numbers mean? Sleep medicine is filled with numbers, okay? And I mean, I don't know what they mean, but they're meaningful numbers. But if those numbers tell you what you need to do next, okay, and how you're going to treat a patient, how you're going to, provide treatment to them, and how are they improving? All of this sort of stuff needs to be done. And that needed all to be taken care of. And that was a process that got started. And standards of practice is one of the most important things that an organization can do. It is one of the most desired publications. When they publish a paper, okay, Journal Sleep, okay, which that's the one clinical paper they want more than anything else. They want that paper because that's a highly cited paper by any researcher who's doing anything with clinical patients in a research study. Those papers are used, and it drives that what they call an index factor. It drives that index factor up. So those were the things that were going on in the fall of 1999 or 96 into 97. And so by the time, and then we had the whole journal editor process move along, and we had to get to that. So now, by the time you get into 1998, David White's rotating out of being president. And I have to tell you that everything I've set up to this point, okay, was driven by him. He shared the same vision of everything I'm telling you here. I had part of that vision. He had part of it. It came together. And if there's a guy that can stick to a plan, okay, and drive it home, David's the guy that could do it, okay? And he deserves a lot of credit because he put so much energy into that first year of making sure that he had a foundation that this place could continue to grow on. I just don't know how the field could thank him anymore. He just made that move. The other move that he made, I want to give him some credit for something else. He tried to merge the two societies, okay? But he really was Don Quixote in that effort. I mean, he was out there all by himself. Nobody else thought that was a good idea. And the one thing about David, and this went on for a long time, there were meeting after meeting after meeting and proposal after proposal after proposal, and it could never sell. And he couldn't sell his own board, and he couldn't sell the other board. But David's the one guy that can lose graciously and move on to the next thing, okay? I'm not like that. I don't lose as graciously, anywhere near as graciously as he would lose. But that is an attribute that not many of us have, okay? And there was a couple of presidents actually that had that attribute that followed him. and we'll get there in a bit. But anyway, that was his greatest disappointment, that he could not merge those two societies. Now, I don't know that stayed with him for long, but I know it was a disappointment. So as you moved out of David's year and you moved into the president-elect, which his name was Wolfgang Schmidt-Nawara, his contribution to the field was mainly two things. One is, after David, everybody needed to take a breath, okay? Because this guy's 24/7, 365. And everybody wanted something, and he wanted to give it to him if he could. And that took a lot of work. But this Wolfgang Schmidt-Nawara was a different character. He was kind of laid back. He was a New Mexico, Texas guy that, everything was fine. The sun always rises, in the east and sets in the west kind of guy. But he had a passion for a couple of things. And one of them was he wanted a foundation, okay, to support research in sleep medicine. And he wanted it when the place didn't have any money, which I always felt was kind of a strange thing. But in principle, I have to say I was the one person who was never in favor of that foundation. And and I'll tell you why. But when you create a foundation like that, and for all the good it does, it changes how people view the organization, okay? And it becomes more of the focal point of some of what a board will do is to manage a foundation. Now, this wasn't in the beginning, but you knew that this could go that way down the line, and it did. And there was a lot of struggles with the foundation. I think there were a lot of struggles with the foundation for who's eligible for a grant and how do you avoid conflicts of interest. Membership in a professional society in itself is a conflict of interest. And I've said that from day one. Members are there to promote their own careers. That's why they're there. That's why they join. Nobody joins just because they got nothing else to do. What can I do to advance the profession that I've chosen? How do I ensure that I can continue to make a living doing this, grow my influence, help people get better? So there's a self-interest in all of it. That's the way membership is, and it is a conflict of interest. And it comes up all the time. Fortunately, most of the conflicts are to the good of the field as well as the good of the individual, and always good for the patient. So they're manageable conflicts. Conflicts, when you start giving grants out, that becomes a little different thing. And it creates other challenges to an organization that I don't think it's no way to prepare everybody for it. But anyway, the foundation started and it grew and it became a pretty significant part of the organization over the years. So what did we do in the office over that first year? We actually introduced computers, okay? And they didn't have it. We introduced a network into the office, a computer network and email. And so there's a lot of office things that went on that that it's not worth a lot of discussion, but you have to understand none of that existed. So we had to build out an infrastructure within the office while we're building out an infrastructure to advance, the profession. So those things are going on simultaneously. And we made a lot of progress in 1 year. In fact, we went from a manual registration at a meeting in 1996 to a computer-based registration in 1997. Clumsy as it was, okay, with all the problems that it ended up having, but it was the introduction to it, and you needed to have that in order to bring the organization into the computer age, and it had not been up to that point. The other thing that finished up at that point in time, and I want to go back to the Stanford Managing the Journal, is that organizations needed to have, by law in certain states, these organizations, not-for-profit organizations, need to have audits. And it depends on the type of designation you have that requires the audit. And there had not been an audit. So I'm there for the first year, and I said, what part of the agreement that I made with the board is, you need to do an audit of this place because I need to know where everything is at, and I don't, all this money's got to get accounted for, where it's at. You want to make sure everything is right, and that's your obligation. And they agreed to that. So, but it didn't happen right away. It happened in January of 1997, and there was an audit. And part of the audit of an organization includes the holdings of the organization, so the bank accounts and investment accounts and all the rest of that, and the partnership. So the APSS partnership then had to have an audit as well to satisfy both the SRS's legal requirements and the Academy's. And the audit report came back with, was a qualified audit for the APSS. And the significance of that is a qualified audit means we can't account for the money. We don't know where it's at. We're making some assumptions, but we can't tell. The meeting is fine. That we know where the money's at. The journal, we don't have any idea what's going on with that. We can't find out, and we can't get the information from staff. This was in the audit report. And so that was the catalyst that said, okay, we got to pull the management of the journal from Stanford and stick it in Rochester, Minnesota, with the Academy. And that's what happened, okay? And that was quite the ruckus. So that happened, and that was in the midst of the transfer when you're going into San Francisco to get a new journal editor, and everybody thought that we were out to get Stanford, but we really weren't. You needed to account for advertising money and printing costs and all the rest of this, and they just couldn't do it. So anyway, and I think that let me back up a second, because Stanford is so big, okay? You're not even a footnote like on a financial statement for Stanford, okay? They didn't care. They didn't do anything. This wasn't something that, they were incompetent, okay? They just didn't care about it, okay? So they always care about losing journals, but they didn't really care about anything else that went with it, okay? And it wasn't, nobody stole any money and nobody misappropriated any money. Just nobody accounted for it because there wasn't that much. But anyway, so the journal came to the Academy then, and now you go to San Francisco, and the guy who had resigned actually reapplies for his job, and there was a 3-day meeting out there trying to decide on who a new editor would be. And it finally turned out after 3 days that a guy by the name of Tom Roth, which is a name you've heard me say before, he is the guy that they finally decided between the two groups. And remember now they're back to just one vote, okay? They don't have so everybody had to agree. And this compromise thing, is as painful as it was, really did tell all the people involved that now you got to work together and people have to come to compromise. You don't need to be unanimous, but a majority of people need to agree on what you're going to do. And that process solidified that going forward. And I can't tell you how important that was. It mattered. So finally, Tom Roth is appointed the editor. And so simultaneously, he takes over now in, 6 months, I guess, in January, he was going to take over. And in the meantime, so between June and January, you have to get the management stuff from Stanford, and we started to publish the journal in Rochester, and there's just a ton of work that goes into publishing that. And then we were starting to publish abstracts. So all these publications and everything got into the Rochester office, and the Rochester office wasn't big enough. So we needed to move it. So within a year of being there, we actually moved the office from where it was to, and you would think in a place like Rochester, that'd be easy enough to do, but it wasn't, because there weren't office buildings, because everything was Mail or IBM and everybody else sold something. So they didn't need an office building. And so we ended up in a warehouse where people sold stuff but had extra warehouse space, and converted that to office space. And that's where all of this took place. So we moved, changed the name, did all of this stuff, and we're barely a year into this. So the next couple of years were actually pretty stable, and they were catch-up years. Gigi Cater came in after Wolfgang, and she was a calming influence, okay? And she was somebody that dealt mainly with patient groups and that group that we were trying to get lined up because we quit giving them money, okay? And once you quit giving people money, that kind of angers them. And, you know, there's a lot of accusations that you're cheap and you won't help them, you don't care, and, you know, on and on and on. But what we had tried to do, okay, and we were never successful at it, is felt that the National Sleep Foundation, okay, should be the umbrella organization for all the patient groups and bring them all under that umbrella. And that one group then could take on a lot of PR on the patient side of sleep disorders, and then manage these patient groups and you know, look at their issues and legislation, all the rest of that. That never happened. In my opinion, the National Sleep Foundation always wanted to be what the Academy was, and it just didn't work that way. So quickly, we had moved in Rochester, okay? But immediately after that move, it became absolutely clear that while space wasn't a problem, access to the correct people to work in the organization became a huge problem because there was nobody in the area that had any experience in the level of association management that we're now into. And you needed people that had skills that just weren't available there. And you needed skills in, you know, computer science. You needed networks and, you know, a lot of stuff that you just couldn't get them because Mayo hired them all. So, and I made the plea to the board, and we immediately started working on moving the organization from Rochester, Minnesota to Chicago. And that was a pretty painful process for people. And mainly the staff people who were up there because they couldn't move to Chicago. You can come from Chicago to Minnesota, to Rochester, Minnesota, but you can't go the other way, right? Chicago's too big, too busy, it's too much, and they didn't want to go. And they had families and whatnot. But I can tell you that the board was very gracious with how they handled that and outplaced people and worked very well. But in the end, the organization did move to Chicago, and it moved to Oak Brook, Illinois, a suburb just outside of the city of Chicago. And that took place, and that really allowed the organization to grow in terms of what it could do, how it transferred to a digital society, okay, and how it was able to find the right number of staff people, okay, who could come in and really get the organization kicked off. And so that was hugely important. And John Shepard was supportive of that and behind that, and it wouldn't have happened without him. And everybody recognized it had to be done, but the human cost was something they were very conscious of and very respectful of. And I think that everybody had gotten taken care of as best that they could. So that was a huge thing. But there are two other significant things that occurred right around that same time. One of them was reimbursement. And sleep centers within the society back then were splintered among themselves because you really had three types of a sleep center. Okay? Some could argue two, but I'll give you the three. You had clinical sleep centers. And those were people that were in freestanding sleep centers. They were medical practices. That's what they were. And they ran their own practice. They were responsible for it. They funded it. They staffed it. And they ran it just like any other medical clinic would run itself. And then there were academic sleep centers. Now, they were tied to academic hospitals. We're in Tennessee now, so it would be like the University of Tennessee. It would have an academic, and the thing that there's usually a medical school associated with it. Okay, there's all sorts of training programs for physicians that go on there, and they have different types of staffing levels in all the centers and whatnot because people rotate through, and it's more convoluted. It's not nearly as direct, and they're not as dependent. The people who work there are salaried. Salaried physicians were not the norm in the time period we're talking about. So guys in sleep centers in there, they either made it or they didn't. And then you had hospital-based centers. And hospital-based centers essentially turned out to be convoluted freestanding centers because hospitals couldn't make decisions in the same way that a freestanding center. They know if they're going to buy a piece of equipment, hire a person, not hire a person. In a hospital, you had to go through the committees. You had all kinds of bureaucracy that needed to occur. But all three of those types of sleep centers existed, and they all had a different approach to doing the same thing, okay? And they all got paid the same amount of money. The problem was there were enough differences in there that it was like herding cats, okay? And it was very painful for the freestanding guys, okay, because they delayed things so much. But they had to keep their centers going. They didn't have the resources, and you never have the resources to compete with a hospital. They got all sorts of ways to do things, but you don't have that. So that was a difficult time, and that lasted for a long time. That was not something that ended, but it's something that started. One of the things that helped solve that, okay, so that the differences were not, is that I was able to get accreditation tied to reimbursement. So what does that mean? So the Academy had a very robust accreditation of sleep center program. And it was almost a cottage industry within the organization. It was big, it was meaningful, okay? And it's what helped patients directly today, okay? The research is fine. You need to find, we need more information. That's an important thing. But I'm dealing with people today, and I can't wait for you to publish a paper. Medical judgment comes into play. Clinical practice standards come into play. And they needed that sort of stuff, and we needed to give it to them, and we did. So tying that reimbursement, academic centers always want more money because, we got more expense. It costs us more to do it, and blah, blah, blah. The knock is that everybody got the same amount of money, okay? But what that did is it made people now needed to follow a set of rules. So renegade sleep centers could no longer operate. People who did things that were just clearly unusual or uncomfortable in the medical world, they didn't do them. They couldn't do them and get paid. So you had to be a legitimate person. We needed to bring legitimacy to the field. We did it with the AMA. We're about to do it with the board exam. But in clinical medicine, they needed it. And legitimacy was brought through accreditation. And once you tied reimbursement to it, all the people who couldn't do it, all right, they then did. So now you have to set up a set of rules for reimbursing sleep centers and how they're going to practice care. Okay, that came to a head when the guy sitting across from me became president, and he got to untie that Gordian knot for a couple of years and did a great job with it, by the way. But it's a bigger issue than what most people would ever imagine it was, but we tried to contain it within. So that was going on out there. If you wanted to get paid for conducting a sleep test and for providing a patient with care therapy, okay, once you diagnose the patient, okay, you need to, provide the care. And in order to get paid by Medicare, all right, then you needed to say, are you a legitimate organization? Are you a legitimate? We don't know. There's people out there billing for sleep all over the place, and we need to get our arms around it. We can't get our arms around it. And I'm the one that came up and said, how about accreditation? Okay, because accreditation, the American Academy of Sleep Medicine publishes a set of standards that you need to meet. And your accreditation period is not one and done. It's a renewal thing. So you have to stay up on it. And there's all sorts of reporting that has to go on. And this is where this becomes a cottage industry, okay? This was a big deal. And people had to go out to your sleep center and make sure you were actually doing what you said you were going to do. It was a huge investment on the part of the Academy. It was a huge investment on part of the sleep center. And Medicare loved it. Okay. Now, one of the things that I brought, and I didn't touch on this, but one of the things I brought to the American Academy of Sleep Medicine when I came was my Rolodex. That was my most important asset, is I knew everybody. Okay. And so I knew who to call at Medicare to have these conversations, who to get the paperwork to. All right. And I can't, that was so valuable to me. I had same connections in the Congress, and I had similar connections. Not nearly as much at NIH, but I built them over the time. But clinically, in clinical medicine, I knew who was who everywhere. So, and that was a big help. And I never shared that with anybody. I mean, my Rolodex was like the most sacred, the Holy Grail. That was it. And everybody respected that. So, in order to get paid, that's it. Now, that's only Medicare. So only about 30% of the patient population then becomes Medicare. What happens to the rest of the people? Insurance companies around that time said, we're not going to pay for care any more than the government's willing to pay for it. So insurance companies then adopt the same rules that Medicare adopts. So the insurance companies said, if you want paid by Blue Cross or Blue Shield, you got to be accredited. And it snowballed. All the big insurers did that. There were a group of people, doctors, and some very legitimate doctors, okay, that practiced good sleep medicine. They just didn't want to be in an accredited sleep facility. They got axed out. There's a side piece to this story that goes that Medicare would not allow this to happen if we were the only people who did it. In my previous work experience, I knew a guy, his name was Jim Anderson, who was very influential at an organization that accredited hospitals. Okay? And so I got a hold of this guy and said, look, can you get it so that you can, in your report of accreditation of a hospital, designate that the sleep lab is accredited along with the hospital. Okay? And that seems odd, but that's what happened with pathology labs. So pathology labs broke out of a hospital accreditation and got looked at separately. This guy was able to do it for us. God rest his soul, he passed away several years ago, but he was able to do it in sleep medicine. So now JACO could have cared less about. That's the Joint Commission for the Accreditation of Hospitals. So they could have cared less about a sleep, but they accredited and they said so. And that's all Medicare wanted, and we gave that to Medicare. Okay? There wasn't a point, Dan Bicey actually wanted to merge our accreditation into JACO. You can imagine how that conversation went. But Dan actually, he came around, he saw the light and moved away from that and stuck with insomnia. But anyway, that's how that happened. And that was huge. And it saved clinical sleep medicine. I believe that was the saving thing. And that's the piece that when I keep talking about, people need to come together and stop all the arguing and the fighting and join together. And that did that. Because now when you went to Medicare, okay, when it came time for those discussions and reimbursement, okay, sleep went and represented itself, okay? And it represented all sleep centers across the board, so everybody was on board with that. They still had their issues with, do we have to have this and do we have to have that? And hospitals have, bathrooms every 2 feet and, freestanding centers, you have to actually walk 20 feet to get to the bathroom, and is that good or bad? And you had those kinds of debates, but those were all manageable. So that was huge, and it played out for the rest of the time I was there. I suspect it's true today, but I don't know for sure. That was it, and we spent a lot of time in Medicare changing rules and changing all the things that needed to be updated as technology came into sleep. Okay. Changing these things in these codes and their definitions and the reimbursement form was very critical. But if you never were there in the first place, you could have never gotten in on those discussions, and it would have just all disintegrated, but it didn't. So that's that piece. Now, one last piece one other piece, not the last piece, but another piece is this board certification business. So the American Board of Sleep Medicine had gone out and talked to the people where all the boards are at, okay? And it's the American Board of Internal Medicine. These are very convoluted organizations, and I can spend a lot of time with it. But suffice to say, there's a national group that all the specialties boards fall under. And the sleep board went out there and tried to talk with them and trying to get them to accept them. And they just said, no, it's not going to happen. Okay, so just go away and don't bother us anymore. And they were very frustrated with it. There's a lot of anecdotal things that happen, a lot of unexpected things or opportunities that just pop up. Okay, so it's not like there was some genius move behind it. But I was at a student conference at the AMA. It's one I didn't want to go to either. Okay, the medical students were there. They annoyed me, and I didn't really want to fuss with it. And Jerry Rosen, you remember him from New York? Okay, so he was there. And he was at that conference, and he just, come on, you got to go, you got to go, you got to go, you got to go. And I thought, all right, I'll go. And I didn't want to go, but I went. And at the time, there was a blockage. There were new medical specialties, subspecialties coming up. Okay. And they were all trying to get the same thing we were looking for. And they'd say, well, you can't get a board exam unless you get training programs. You can't get training programs unless you get a board exam. And this kept going back and forth and back and forth. There was a group called Pain Medicine. And Pain Medicine got a hold of me. They had heard me give a talk somewhere. And they got a hold of me and they said, would you come and talk at our strategic planning meeting? Okay. And I don't even remember what I talked about, all right? But they said, would you come and talk about it because you guys have this board and you're doing this, that. And I went to the strategic planning meeting. They were very nice people and ended up talking to them, okay? Later on, they come back and wanted to hire me. We're now at this, they decided that they were going to sue, okay, the ACGME and the American Board of Medical Specialists. So graduate medical education and board, they were going to sue them. And they had filed suit, okay? Now, I'm at this meeting with students, and the guy who's running the medical education, the training programs that you have to complete before you can take an exam, okay? That's graduate medical education. I overhear a conversation with this guy talking about this lawsuit that was filed, all right, by the pain people against the two of them because they won't admit any new board. They hadn't admitted a new board in 20 years or something like that. So a little bit later, this guy's off by himself, and I walk up to him and I said, I'll solve your problem for you. And he said, what do you mean you'll solve I said, I'll solve your problem. So we go into his office, all right? And I said, look, I'm ready to apply for a board exam, okay? And I'm ready to apply for training programs, okay? And I'll jump through all the hoops you need to jump through, okay, for training programs. He said, what are you going to do with the board? I said, I'm not going to do anything with the board. I'm not talking about the board. We're just talking about, we want training programs in sleep medicine. We want standardized training. We want it where everybody's on the same page and everybody goes through the same training. I said, I already got an exam. I don't care about the exam. I said, and if you approve us, you're golden. Then you can say, well, they went through it. Because they had a 6-step process. It was the most convoluted thing you ever saw in your life. The application was 2,000 pages of material that we sent them, okay? And it started out, and I'm going to back to my Mayo guy, John Shepard. So John Shepard was truly a president that was as dedicated as anybody you'll ever find. He got together a group at the board and they wrote a paper, that Shepard paper. I mean, it's seminal paper, okay, about the history of sleep medicine and how it worked and all of the rest of that. And that became the foundation. That was more the cover letter of then all of this other information we had to give in journals and all this other stuff. We take a year and put this application together. It wasn't quite a year, but it was a long time. We put this application together, okay? And a lot of people were involved in it. But John Shepard cleaned it all up, put it together, and we sent it in. Okay? And they accept our application, and they move it through their process, and now it comes for a site visit. Okay? So we're going to site visit. Now, all of this is happening. We're still in Rochester. So Chicago actually came after this. So I'm kind of going back and forth with time. So 9/11 occurs, and we're all sitting there watching what happened with all the shock and horror of everybody else. Okay. And the following day was the day that we were supposed to have a site visit for this ACGME thing at Mayo Clinic. Okay. A guy by the name of Marvin Dunn. He was an older guy. You remember Marvin? Okay. Guy was about 100 back then. Okay. But he was the nicest guy ever. I love that guy. And so planes didn't go for about 2 days, I think. The first day that a plane comes back, we moved the site visit to Mayo. And of course, Shepard was running the sleep center at the time. And so he was committed and ready to go. So this guy, Marvin Dunn, comes up. I run down to the Rochester airport and pick him up. He's the only guy on a plane. So Dunn comes up. He's the only guy on a plane, and he could care less. I mean, he's like, nothing happened. That's fine, First time I had a whole plane to myself, and nobody wanted to get on a plane. And we did the site visit at Mayo, okay? And then all the pieces started to fall into place, okay? So now we're going through, and it takes a long time to get this done because you have to now you got to get out into hospitals and start setting up training programs. It's a big process. We don't have time for all of that. But suffice to say, it happened. Down the road a piece, I get a call by a guy named Harry Kimball. Harry Kimball was the guy that ran the American Board of Internal Medicine, and he's the guy that told the people that ran the American Board of Sleep Medicine to take a hike. You're never going to get an exam. And he says, you got to come out he's in Philadelphia. He said, can you come out to Philadelphia and talk to me? I said, sure. So I go out there, and he says, I got to hand it to you. He said, you're the only guy that's ever done this. I didn't realize that, okay? But he said, you're not getting training programs and keeping your exam. That's not going to happen, okay? He said, you have to come to terms with that. And I said, yeah, I'm sure. I said, I can come to terms with that. Organizationally, we can come to terms with that, okay? But you got to come to terms with, you're going to have to be fair, okay? And you're going to have to give a little, and we're going to have to sit down, and we're going to have to work this thing out, okay? And we'll give up the exam. And he said, well, you got to, we have to look at your exam. We got to blah, 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 blah. And I said, yeah, that's understood. We agree with that. And there was another man there, Schreiber, I think his name was, who ran the neurology board. And he got into the thing. So the three of us end up in a book club, okay? Can you imagine that? Harry Kimball and me, and we're just passing books around for the next several years. So, and that's how the exam thing got started. So it's overhearing a conversation. We get the board exams. Then we moved and went through the application process and got the board exams later on down the road, something around 2006 before the whole thing got approved. And then all of that fell into the lap of the guy sitting across from me on how are we going to do all this. So I think we need to spend just a couple minutes more on this board certification and the transition from the ABSM to the American Board of Medical Specialties, because it was not as smooth or comfortable a transition, nor was it as quick a transition as everybody thought. So when all that happened, we were given a date that it would happen within, and it was like 18 months or 2 years before it would actually take effect. And they allowed that so that the existing board then could go out of business, as it were. And part of the agreement is that the academy could no longer offer an examination to physicians. Okay, once it kicked in, then that was it. There was a lot of discussion about grandfathering people in, and that was a real bone of contention, and it actually did not happen. Everybody had to take some sort of an exam. I don't believe anybody was transitioned in. The exception to that was there was a group of people, small group of people, who worked on an exam writing committee. And whatever number of people, I don't remember the exact number of people, but those were the handful of people that didn't have to take the exam. They were granted by virtue of putting the exam together. But everybody else needed to take the exam. And you can imagine the consternation that went on with that. And a lot of people, so the Academy came out and said, we will continue to recognize those people who were board certified by the American Board of Sleep Medicine, okay, past the date when the exam transitions over. So if you took it and you don't want to take it, there were a number of people who were within, 5 years of retirement and getting out of the practice, and they didn't want to go through it, and everybody knew that. But everybody else had to take the exam. And there were a lot of people then who rushed to take the exam. So for a few years, those rooms were just packed all over the country. And by that time, we had talked, a while back about the board being a very manual process, but that had all changed. And we moved it to a completely electronic process, and there were exam centers all over the place, and it was quite different exam. But a lot of people moved to take that exam because, first of all, I think they wanted to find out where they were in terms of skill level, okay, if they were going to actually take the next exam with the American Board, or the American Board of Medical Specialties exam, find out, get a baseline of where you're at and where you have to bone up on things before you go. And a lot of people were going to take it, and they just weren't going to go any further than that because all they wanted was an accredited center. So the transition got to be pretty convoluted. And it was compounded by gearing up for the training programs that were going to occur and getting that process in place and these had to go into academic training centers. They were not freestanding centers, were not groups that could be approved to have fellowship training programs at first. I don't know where they're at now, but at first they couldn't do it. So you had to go to a teaching hospital or an academic hospital, and get those programs up and going. So you had that going on in this exam. It was a very hectic time. The other real contentious part of that is the PhDs, and this is where it really came to a head. And there were a lot of people, and the PhDs were pretty instrumental in putting that exam together, scoring that exam. They put a lot of work into that exam. They had a huge stake in it, and now it's being pulled out from under them. And there was it was just not something you could do. The American Board of Medical Specialties would not recognize anybody other than a medical doctor, okay, as a board certified sleep specialist. And I don't know. The hard feelings never really ended the rest of the time. They sort of drifted off and drifted away. But in addition to that, you have to understand their position. First of all, they let them take an examination. And one can argue whether they should have or shouldn't have, but it's irrelevant. And then because of that, they were able to be medical directors of sleep centers. And that went away. So they lost their credential, and they lost their jobs as medical directors to accredited sleep centers. And because you could only get paid if you had an accredited sleep center, you had to give your job up to a medical doctor. Those were very hard and very, very difficult times for the Academy. And there were a lot of hurt feelings, and there was a lot of pain that everybody experienced it, okay? But it was part of what had to happen for this to progress to where everybody really wanted the field to go. And so that took a good number of years before that happened. And then when the exam kicked in, there was a surge of people. But I think that if there's a disappointment in that process, at least from where I sit, it was we could not get the number of training programs up to start feeding the exam in the future. So you just could not add the numbers. Okay. And that was a struggle when I left, and hopefully that's been resolved since then. So once the examination transitioned over, the American Board of Sleep Medicine then, and I cautioned the board, don't let this go, because if you let this name go, okay, somebody will pick it up and start offering an examination, okay, and people will take it. It'll become a rogue examination, and it'll cause no end of trouble. And everybody agreed with that. So what happened was they looked at testing other people in the field. So behavioral sleep medicine, for an example, which was the PhD area that with insomnia that caught on. And there were some physicians that took that examination as well. And then the tech exam moved over there for a while. I don't know if it's still there or not, but tech licensing became a big issue. And training programs for technologists became big issues as well. But simultaneously, the need for techs started to drop off. So there were more techs now than were actually needed. At one time, that was not the case, but now that was becoming the case because the portable monitoring had been introduced into sleep medicine, the home sleep testing, and a large part of the overnight testing was starting to shrink. Sleep labs were using fewer beds and fewer nights, and everybody was in a transition, and it hadn't really quite shaken out yet, and people didn't know what to do. So for a while, the American Board of Sleep Medicine just tried to be available to other behavioral technologists. And at one time there was some discussion about dentists moving over there, and that of course didn't go anywhere. But all of that was sort of what they did, and that's where it was when I left. So if it's changed from over the last 5 years or however long, 7 years now, I guess it's been since I've been gone. So I wouldn't know. So I have to leave that at that. So the American Board of Internal Medicine, okay, was the primary board, and they accepted other boards, other recognized boards, neurology, pediatrics, ENT, and what was the other one? Anesthesiologists, okay? But they all had to take the same exam, but they were all part of that whole process, okay? So the various specialties, so for example, if you were a neurologist, you took the sleep exam through the neurology board. It was the same exam if you would have taken it from internal medicine, but because whatever your specialty was, and there were really only two primary specialties. There was pulmonary and the neurology. Those were the two main ones. But pediatrics fell into that. There were a handful of pediatrics. They were probably the third group, and then a few ENTs and a few anesthesiologists. So, so you sat and took the sleep test wherever your primary board was, and if you didn't have if your primary board wasn't there, then if you had an American Board of Sleep Medicine certification, all right, then you would have gone to ABIM to take the test. It was very complicated at the time, and people didn't know what to do. But it was the same exam. So it's just a matter of where you took it. And then, and I don't know if that's still that was the case when I left. I don't know what the case is now. I think most of it now, or right before I left, most of it was all going through internal medicine because it was mainly internists who were going into the additional 1 year of training in sleep. But I don't know where that's at now. And JCSM. So there was always a tension and a disappointment that clinical people could not get things published in sleep. Sleep had turned into they only wanted hard science, and they wanted like the practice guidelines that we published, okay, but case reviews and those sorts of things that were important to clinicians, they couldn't get them accepted into sleep, and So that became more and more of a problem. In the meantime, years and years ago, when I first got there, the old ASDA had a bulletin that they used to publish, and they stopped publishing it. It was kind of like People magazine. Okay, this one's doing this and this one's doing that and whatnot. It was kind of fun. And I think there's still some hard copies of that around somewhere. And it's a pretty good historical document if you're interested and wanted to go back and find out who did what, if you're that much of a historian. But anyway, so it kind of drifted out. And there was clearly a need, okay, for a clinical journal. And the board decided that we would start the Journal of Clinical Sleep Medicine. And Stuart Kwan became the first editor of the journal, okay? And if there could ever have been the perfect editor for a clinical journal, it was Stuart. And Stuart put his heart and soul into the development of that journal, and he really made something of that journal. It took off instantly. It was virtually an instant success, and it was due to his hard work. It really was. And he put a lot of time in that. He put a lot of effort in that. We committed a lot of staff to that. And it was all done in-house. The membership loved it. We registered it, and I think it had somewhat of an impact factor, but it wasn't a great impact factor. And there was always the debate, do you start to publish academy standards of practice papers in that, or do you leave them in sleep? And that was a huge debate. And sleep needed it because they wanted the impact factor. They wanted the citations. It became clear before I left that the journal Sleep was becoming a nightmare for the academy. And it was the management of it was complicated by the SRS and the Academy organizations trying to run a journal that was part of APSS. So initially, the Academy offered to buy the journal Sleep from the SRS. And you can imagine how well that went over. And which I think everybody knew that's exactly what their response would be. But what it triggered, which is what they wanted it to do, was to trigger the SRS and come back and say, we'll buy it. Okay? And then we're going to take it to Elsevier or whoever they took. I think it was Elsevier they took it to. And they started publishing the journal. So the expense of getting rid of us trying to publish that sleep journal and all the work that went into it, and all the online work that went into it, when you got rid of that expense, plus, they got some money for it, but I don't think the money that they got for it was monumental. And part of the agreement, I remember, was that the members still got the journal as part of their membership. And I don't know, I guess that's really about all it was. And I think meeting abstracts stayed in the journal Sleep too. But members were always going to get Sleep as long as it was being published as part of their membership. And that was the agreement that was reached. And I think everybody was better off in the end. That was kind of a last minute thing when I was finishing up. That happened, I think, maybe in 2015 or 2016, 2016 probably, when that happened. But that was JCSM. And then I guess after Stuart was the editor of JCSM for a long time. And then Nancy Collop, okay, had a huge interest in JCSM and had a huge interest in being editor. And I think she followed Stuart, okay, and was equally as diligent in the time that I was there. So they've only had two editors in all that time. But hopefully that was that. But right around the time that JCSM came in, okay, you had the Institute of Medicine report, and that's a critical document that I think deserves a little bit of discussion. So the Institute of Medicine, they often did reports on healthcare, specialties, hospitals, all sorts of different things. And this is my opinion, okay? Their prestige was sort of self-inflicted, okay? I don't know that anybody really viewed it, but it was almost this Wizard of Oz thing, okay? They created this mystique that their reports were, really very valuable and helpful and insightful and all the rest of that. And a lot of people believe that to be the case. I was not one of those people. But they wanted to do a report on sleep, all right? And they wanted to get the various organizations involved in it, including they needed the Academy to sign on. They needed the SRS to sign on. They wanted to get NIHLBI to sign on, and they did. And so there were some big players in there, and there was some big money put into that. The biggest money was put in by NHLBI, but at any rate, we put a lot of money into it. And the Institute of Medicine, they studied this thing for a long time, and they had a board on there. And the board was of some pretty well-known, the people that put the report together were some pretty well-known people in the field. And then after whatever amount of time it took them to do it, this report came out, and it was stunning what they wrote. And basically said that, I'll paraphrase it in my terms, but essentially the way sleep was being run now was not the best way, not the most efficient way to do it, and the whole thing should be turned upside down. They were also very critical of NHLBI, and that created a real problem. So Betsy Nabel was the person who was running NHLBI. Claude L'Enfant had retired. Nabel had come in, and she put a lot of money into this report and was really hopeful that it would have been a more positive report, and one that's not so, even though it may have had a lot of suggestions, wouldn't be as critical as it turned out to be. And her relationship with the sleep community and her relationship with the IOM, the Institute of Medicine, just kind of collapsed with the publication of that report. And it's kind of funny because, I actually had a chance to meet her and went to her installation, which is it was a strange thing how they install people as a director of an institute at NIH, but it's kind of a big deal. And there's a lot of people go out there as reception and all the rest of that. And her and I actually were starting to have a pretty good relationship, but it all collapsed. Not because of me or not because of anybody, but it collapsed. And it divided the field. There was terrible division in the field. And some of that I think probably had remained until I left. It was that controversial. And people who well-known, well-established, well-respected in the field were at odds with each other. I mean, we talked about Chuck Zeisler, we talked about Alan Pack. Okay, they just could not get along with the stuff that was written in that report. And everybody picked sides. So the fear that I always had in the beginning trying to bring people together, this report was dividing them and taking them completely the other way. But nevertheless, it was there, and it was out there, and it was published, and everybody in the world had a copy of it. And so the best thing to do was to use it, okay, as the next agenda for the Academy. This is what's in there. Now, we either need to address them or we need to refute them, but the roadmap for what we have to do is laying in this book. And it's a hardcover book. I mean, it's around, I'm sure a lot of people have it. You don't have to read too deep into it to figure out, where it's going. But it was one way to do that. Now, and we those of us who didn't like the report, I think were more enthusiastic about using it, okay, as a model for the things that you wanted to change, maybe not in the direction that they wanted it to change, but change from what it was to what it needed to be. It failed to take into account clinical reality of today. That's what it failed to do. It didn't address patients' needs. It didn't do anything about better treatments. It didn't do anything about patient education. It didn't do anything about how to bring practitioners into the field and get people trained up or get technologists trained up. It was just pretty critical. And those are the things that, and through Dr. Epstein's presidency, that report was a major deal. The other major deal during his presidency was the issue with the technologists, because this licensure thing now had just gone crazy, and states were writing professional regulations on licensure for techs, and that's not such a big deal because everybody in a state has some sort of practice act or whatever it is you do. I mean, barbers have it, and salon people have it, and everybody has a license. Okay, has an act that recognizes their license and says what they do. And the techs had now entered into that world. And that's an ugly world when you get into it, because there's a lot of fighting and gnashing of teeth. And then there is this sense of expanding one's role in a field where there's no basis to put it, no basis for it. But fortunately, Larry Epstein was president and was able to navigate those waters, although Larry was kind of like, I'm kind of in the middle here, only everybody's firing in and I don't have a gun. So, and the tech issue was one of those, the PhD issue was one of those, this whole Institute of Medicine was one of those. So it was a interesting couple of years when he was in the leadership, and fortunately he never got out of leadership. So stayed in it and is in it to this day. So that's a good thing. But anyway, that Institute of Medicine report, I think, could have been used to really set the stage for the next 10 years. Okay? And so one of the things that happens in the association world is when you come in and you have this group of people that are hard charging, and we had that group of people and they did a lot of things. The further away from that group you get, okay, memories then don't remember. People don't remember what happened and how they just think it was always there, but it wasn't always there. And they get tired of hearing me telling them that, and they get tired of having other people tell them that. They're setting off and they're going off in a new direction. And Larry Epstein was the transition president that went off in that new direction. And he was balancing the old and balancing the new, okay, and did a masterful job at it. But there is one thing about his presidency that I'll never forget. He was so conscious of being a good president, he actually went to a fashion person to get clothes picked out for him so that he would be dressed for just the right occasion, for just the right meeting, and he wouldn't be in a lab coat. And that's like my best Larry Epstein story. I got others, but that's the one I'll tell. So a couple of things I want to touch on before we finish up that I think were pretty big events for the organization. And one of it is that we built in 2009, once again, we grew out of the space that we were in Oak Brook, and space was becoming pretty expensive to rent. And the board was pretty financially, was in pretty good shape. The organization was in terrific financial shape. So they decided, we looked around to buy a building. And we actually took the board on road trips all over the area looking at buildings, and nothing really jumped out. So we actually built our own building. And we found a piece of land and hired an architect and a construction company, and we built a building. And I think the location of the building was actually a very perfect location. It was easy to get to from the airports, either O'Hare or from Midway if you flew in there. But for the employees, it was easy to get to because you could get to this place from the highways and through all the suburbs, and you took pretty major roads to get there. But it was in a setting that was really not commercial. You were surrounded by a forest preserve, And it just gave you the sense that you were in the country, but you really weren't. You were 5 minutes from, less than 5 minutes from anything you wanted. So it turned out to be a really nice location. We built a building. It had a nice dedication ceremony to it. Moved a lot of things into the building. And originally, it was a 2-story building with a basement in it. And the basement was actually a warehouse. And we used that. We shipped product all over the place. And so we used it an awful lot down there. And then there was one floor was office space, and the second floor was meeting space. And it didn't take long before the office space got to be, again, tightened, and we stopped with the meeting space and moved office space up to where the meeting space was. So the whole building was pretty much occupied by the staff. And the building came in. I think the building cost $6 million to buy. And there was $1 million worth of land with it. So we had a substantial parking area with it, and we had some outside areas. It was really a nice place, and it was a good deal. And the academy was able to pay cash for it, so it didn't have any tax implications for if you rented it, and so you didn't have any of that with being a 501c6. If you have a mortgage on a building and you're a C6 and you get rent, then that just creates all sorts of tax problems. But we didn't have that, so no point in getting into it. So it was a nice building, and I think everybody enjoyed it. And the parking was plentiful. Getting to there and from was back. It was nice furniture. It was a nice place. That was good. So, and I think that's a milestone when an organization gets big enough they can slap their name on a building. And so I thought it was an attractive building. They thought it was an attractive building, and I think it was very enjoyable. Unfortunately, the world, I guess, went crazy, and I don't know how much. I don't know how often it's used now or how much it's used, but it was a solid investment at the time. And 2 things went on at that time. Actually, there were three other things I want to talk about. One was, back to sleep centers for a second. One of the nagging problems in accreditation and nagging problems with sleep centers was to find a standardized mechanism for comparing technologist to technologist and sleep center to sleep center. Was there any way that you could standardize it and collect the data, and you could say that these people are way out of line with most people or not, and who was way out of line and who wasn't? And somebody else could probably describe the technical aspects of interscore reliability, but for a layman, I think that's what it was. And my idea, Rich Rosenberg's, who worked for us at the time, and Rich Rosenberg was a PhD, or still is a PhD, I'm sure. And he worked in a lab, and he worked with many, many techs, and he trained many, many techs, and he was intimately familiar with the need for interscore reliability. How do we make this? He knew of the need. He knew how the system worked, and we had a very young, very smart IT person, who's now your executive director, Steve Van Hout, who wanted to do something program-wise that was different than memberships and the sort of standard database-driven programs that most associations did. So between Steve and Rich, and I bowed out of it pretty much. I kept going with it, but I wasn't in the development of it at all. I knew conceptually that needed to be done. I knew that if it were done, every sleep center, accredited sleep center, would buy the service. And I knew that the value of that information, was boundless. And I don't know what Rich thought about it. He thought, I know Rich felt that it would really improve the quality of the tech and the service and the education of the. So I had all those applications, and Steve, I think, just looked at it as a challenge. But I looked at it as an enormous service, okay, to the accreditation. Larry Epstein, he was enthusiastic about it and looked at it and, had some input into it at the time, running a lab and how it would work and where the problem areas were. But eventually, and it wasn't all that long, it was okay. Now, it cost us a considerable amount of money in R&D to put that together. But fortunately, the organization had a really stable financial position it was in at this point in time. It allowed us to do that. And it allowed us to do something else. So we rolled that out, and immediately, once we rolled interscore reliability out, it was an instant. It was instantly successful. And I don't know any sleep center that didn't subscribe to the service or that didn't use it or was unhappy with it. All right? And when you can get doctors to pay for something that they like, okay, and they keep paying for it and they don't gripe about it, that's a winner. It just is. You don't find that very often, but that's what we had with interscore reliability. And people actually relied on getting those reports. So that worked out really well. On the heels of that, we went into, I was a believer that telemedicine was the future. I believed it then, I believe it now. And we immediately got into developing a telemedicine program for the academy. And a lot of people got involved in this. The IT staff, Steve was still running the IT staff at the time, so clearly he was involved in it, and his entire IT team. We hired additional programmers for this. I think Rich was in it, Larry was in it, I was involved in it, and this was something for sleep centers. It was also a way, and we touched on this very early on, that if you didn't live within 50 miles of an accredited sleep center, sleep medicine really wasn't available to you. And telemedicine would change all of that, because your doctor could get into this with a sleep doctor, the patient could get into it with a sleep doctor, okay? So there was all sorts of possibilities with it. Now, it was a struggle, and telemedicine was not easily accepted in the sleep community. I'm not sure it was easily accepted in the medical community at first either. I understand all of that's changed now, but that's not the way it was back then. It was new. I thought it was exciting. I thought it was futuristic. And I think I was right. And I think that we were right to have developed a system, because everybody uses telemedicine right now. Insurance companies all use telemedicine. Hospitals use it. During COVID, you had as many telemedicine visits with your doctor as you ever had personal visits with your doctor. And I lived in Tennessee, where, Tennessee never shut down. So, you could go anywhere you wanted to go if you lived here. And I know that wasn't the case everywhere else, but it was the case here. And so telemedicine was the future. I think, unfortunately, though, it didn't catch on. And they kept it for a while. I know it was there when I left, and I just don't know that it ever got legs. So I'm gonna shift over, because there's a few things I want to touch on that I see that were disappointments, personal disappointments, maybe not disappointments to the organization, personal disappointments, and I'll share those with everybody, because I don't want you to think that everything we did was not a success. Okay. And we tried to make everything that we did be successful, but it's just not always possible, and it wasn't possible now. And I think telemedicine was one of those, but that is one of the disappointments, that didn't work out. I really had high hopes that you could put that together. And again, for the principal reason that people who lived a long way away, okay, could have access to sleep doctor. And anyway, but that was the point of it, and I think it actually was done. I don't know that it was ever as complete as it could be, or as complete as the programmers wanted it to be. They're always wanting to add features and change things around, and so it's a program that's in a constant state of being upgraded, expanded, improved upon. I don't think you ever have a done project with it. But again, I think it was an opportunity that, given a little bit more time, may have caught on, but such is life, I guess. So there's a couple of disappointments that I want to touch on before we close today. One of them obviously was the telemedicine program, but another one, and I don't think the board made wrong decisions the whole time I was there. I think they made two, and I'll touch on both of them. But overall, I mean, with all the decisions that a board made over all the years, that 21 years that I was there, the number of issues that they were forced to wrestle with, you're bound to make some decisions that people think were not good decisions, okay? And people, before I left, people asked me two questions, like, what are you disappointed about? Okay, and who was the best presidents? And I'm going to touch on both of those, but the disappointments were only a couple, and they're worth noting. And one of them happened back around the time that Nancy Collop was president. And probably before she was on the board, but she may not have been president, but I think she was on the board. She was pretty outspoken about this. But everybody knows I'm a conservative. Everybody knows I'm a Republican. That's not, that's no secret to anybody who has known me or been around me. But I was pretty active in Republican political circles. And one day, this is it's a true story, but it's weird. I got a call from Bush the Younger and George Bush. And at the office, I thought Becky Roberts, who was my administrative assistant at the time, almost fell out of her chair. She said, "Well, the White House wants to talk to you." And I said, "Yeah, okay." So it wasn't, it was one of Bush's people, but they call you from. But anyway, that's neither here nor there. I was asked to represent the not-for-profit industry on the President's Economic Council. And it would have involved going to Washington, D.C. Once a month. The expense involved would have been, you wouldn't be in the office probably for 2 days, and it would be a plane fare and a hotel night. And you would have access to this economic council and the higher-ups in the White House. I mean, to me, it was an opportunity to really get the name of the academy out in front of that. But the board was just so much against that. I was stunned at how much against getting involved with George Bush they were. And I think if I was ever caught off guard, you would think that if any president called and said, "Geez, come on up to the White House and I want to hear what you have to say about not-for-profits and their importance and all the rest of this," I would have jumped at the chance. But boy, talk about misreading something. I misread that completely. I still think that was a mistake, because when you're asked to do something like that, if you can't put your political differences aside, but they couldn't, and that's fine. I needed to put mine aside, and I did, and we moved on from that. So anyway, that was one of them. I also think that I've also found that the foundation, and I was never enthusiastic about the foundation, even when it started. And I think the first grants it gave out were $30,000. But by the time I was ready to leave, the foundation had gotten to be a major revenue source for a handful of universities. And the amount of time that was spent by the board, members of the board, on foundation issues and dealing with conflict of interest issues that came up over the time, it became a bit of it sort of took over the interest of where I thought that we were headed with the academy. But more than that, I don't know of a single thing, a study or a result that came out of that foundation that changed anything the academy did or anything that was done in sleep. Now, I understand that it takes a long time and, you have builds up and all the rest of that. but it just seemed like the types of things that were going to impact the field were not coming out of these studies. The most you were getting as a footnote is being a funder of some other grant. And you don't really know what part you played in it or any of the rest of that. So I never really saw that. So the foundation actually was a bit trouble. The telemedicine program we talked about, I guess it was about 2015 that the Academy, and Nate Watson was the driver of this. Nate Watson drove a lot of issues. And one of the issues he drove is the economic impact, of sleep disorders on the American public. And he was as dogged about this issue as any president was about anything. And eventually we found a company by the name of Frost & Sullivan who actually took this project on. And they spent a good deal of time, 6, 8, 9 months, drafting a report, very detailed report. And in the middle of that, I actually had a heart attack and spent some time out of the office. I was pretty sick. It was not a good time in my life for me. But anyway, this report ends up wrapping up and it's published. And like the IOM report, it's not as favorable a report as you would have wanted to see, okay? But it had a lot of good information in it, and it had a lot of things that you could take out of this report and you could build on them. Again, it builds strategically for where you want to move the field. And this was a huge study, and there was a lot of debate. But the Academy never published it, ever. They put it on the website and they just sort of left it there and left that as being published. So if you were a member and if you knew what you were looking for, you could go get this. And years and years ago, I'll go back down to when David White was president. And, we talked about that Chicago paper, and I may have mentioned this earlier. It's been a long time now, but, David always taught me that, whatever you find, you need to share, and whatever you discover, you need to publish. Well, we found out a lot of stuff in that report, and we discovered a lot of things that we weren't sure we knew before that, and yet we didn't publish it. And I think that was a mistake. And it wasn't any individual's mistake. I mean, it's the board. The board voted not to do it, to put it on the website. I think that, not unanimously, but I know Nate never voted for that, but he was pretty disappointed in it because it was a worthwhile study. The only other, I don't know if it's a regret or a disappointment or what, but the Academy became pretty wealthy when I was there. It started out, with $1 million and ended up in excess of $100 million. I think there was probably too much money, but the organization grew. The services you provided, people were willing to pay for, and we paid for speakers and we paid for travel and so we put a lot of money out. We had a good run of success for a long time, but the money starts to take over the conversation, and it begins to be the agenda, as opposed to being used to support the agenda and the plan. So if I had it to do over again, I probably would not have, been as aggressive on that earning side. And I'm the one. I was the biggest one that pushed it. This is not something that the board did or anybody else. This was me. I found it very easy to turn the Academy into a money-making, profit-driven, and it helped a lot of things. The board got to go where they needed to go, do what they needed to do, fund IOM reports, all this business with the ACG, all of that cost a lot of money, and we had the money to do it. But we were very fortunate But sometimes I think that towards the end that it became the agenda as opposed to supporting the agenda. Two things, okay? First of all, it was the board's ability to separate what board responsibilities are and what staff responsibilities. There was a clear division of responsibility in the organization. And once the board, initially the board wanted to do what the staff did because they didn't know what a board did, okay? And I was always somebody who said, I don't want a seat on the board. I don't want to vote on the executive committee. None of that's right. There's members and then there's staff. And then there's things that the staff does that the board just shouldn't fuss around with. And so we had that division to do that. But the board was able to manage the organization and say, this is what the organization needs this. And then we were able to deliver that for them, okay? The board didn't put these programs together, but they had to conceptualize them, or they had to take an idea that I had and conceptualize that into a program, okay? And then once they were presented with a program, they tweaked it, and then the program went into place. I believe that professional organizations, I don't think sleep, if I were in orthopedics, I think I could have done the exact same thing. What we did is watch the expenses. We didn't spend money we didn't need to spend. That was the first thing. We didn't take luxurious travel trips and stay in 5-star hotels and, drink $1,000 bottles of wine. We didn't do any of that, okay? We never did that. People didn't fly first class. So we very much controlled the expenses of the organization. Membership grew because services grew. Educational material grew because the members put it together and they put together stuff people wanted to buy. We had an enormous educational revenue budget that came in from brochures and whatever, okay, in the hospitals. So, and we diversified our revenue. The other thing we became, and this is key, is that in addition to all the stuff that we did, so when you build your membership up, you build up your meeting, you build up your journal, you bring in a lot of money from the advertisers and sponsors and all the rest of that sort of thing. But the other thing that we did is we became a management company for everybody. So in addition to the academy, we ended up managing the SRS, we ended up managing the APSS, we ended up managing the American Board of Sleep Medicine, we ended up with the techs, we ended up with behavioral sleep medicine, okay, and on down the road. At one time, I think we had 11 or 12 different organizations in the management company, okay, that we were responsible for. And it worked out very well for sleep because everybody knew that the American Academy of Sleep Medicine, that was the center group, that was the hub right there, okay? And then everything else sprout out, from them, but they were all connected to the American Academy of Sleep Medicine. And to the extent possible, they were all pretty happy, okay? But there was a lot of work that went into doing that, but there were huge management fees that came as a result of that. So the members, so did the members really pay, for everything? Well, not really, okay, but kinda. So for example, when the techs were there, the techs didn't pay anything out of their own pocket. The centers paid for it. So I was very conscious of centers. We never raised center dues, never. Okay, they got to when I think they were that fee was set shortly after I got there, and it stayed there. We never raised it. We didn't have to raise it. So you grew your revenue by growing the field. We started with 2,000 people and ended with 10,000 people. And the sleep centers, okay, we started with 1,000 sleep centers when I got there, and you ended up with, 7,000 or 8,000 by the time, I don't remember the numbers. You'd have to check those. But the growth of it is really what took care of it, okay? And people got what they wanted to. The meeting grew. The Washington D.C. meeting that I was not yet employed with made $20,000. $20,000, okay? And everybody was ecstatic because they didn't lose money, all right? And then the meetings got up, they made over $2 million. Okay, and because you had vendors, but the fees didn't go up, the registration fee didn't go up, and but the people came. So I don't think anybody was particularly, taxed over that. It was through growth, and I think you can do that pretty much with any organization if you deliver product to them, if you deliver the services that they want, you can do that. But we were also at the right size, okay, and you were at the right time. So I think a lot of those worlds came together. And a lot of it was the trust that the board put in me and in the rest of the staff to make these things work. When you think about what it takes to start up the Journal of Clinical Sleep Medicine, I mean, that's an enormous investment, okay? But it paid off. I mean, it was just, and nobody ever paid a nickel for the Journal of Clinical Sleep Medicine. Okay, it was always just a part of membership. So we didn't raise dues to offset the money. We didn't need to. Okay, so there was enough revenue that came in from meeting revenue and other education activities and whatnot. And when centers, and I'll go back to when reimbursement got tied to accreditation, okay, the sleep centers wanted to continue that going. Okay. I think that there was a point in the economy when sleep centers started to struggle. It was an economic thing. The economy went bad. Things got out of hand. A lot of stuff went bad in the country, and some of the sleep centers had trouble. We helped financially a little in some places, but not nearly as much as we could have. So we were not as generous with people in need as probably we could have been, should have been, I would have been. And I'm not that kind of a giving kind of guy either. I mean, you know that. We put money where we felt that it was needed, and we helped people when we could. But I've always been of the belief, and I've openly said this, that foundation money, while it should continue to have supported the research grants, should have also supported the fellowship training programs through scholarships to get people in and give the centers a break and get them to hire these people and establish with equipment, whatever. I mean, it takes money to start these things, and a little bit of bump to these people. If they knew they were going to get some sort of stipend of, I don't know, $50,000 a year, whatever the money amount is, it might have helped. But that program just never caught on. So circumstances often dictate how successful a person's going to be. When do you? And I'm talking about the presidents of the academy now. And there were 5 presidents who happened to be in leadership at the time where we were in that part of our history dictated that they had to step up and perform at a level higher and a greater commitment than other years. So, before I left the academy, I was always, who was the number one president? Who was the best? Who was the worst? Who was this? Who was that? Who was the other thing? And I've actually broken it down into 2. I've had this since I've retired, actually. And I've just never shared it with anybody till right now. I always classified presidents in 2 categories. There was a group of people, there was a group of 5 people, 5 presidents, who I believe deserve all the credit in the world for the work that they did while they were president to keep that ship afloat. And believe me, at some point in time, I mean, it was not always as smooth as perhaps it sounds today. But clearly the number one guy, and I think the guy, David White, was the number one president. I think David White did as much for the field as Bill Dement did. I didn't know Dr. Kleitman. He had passed away before I got there. I had met Dement any number of times, and I talked to him any number of times, and I was aware of everything that he did. But I can tell you without reservation that I believe David White made as big a contribution to saving the field. Your field, okay, was on the verge of dissolving and going into ACCP and ATS, and it would have just been another service provided for those people had it not been for David. Okay, he was that instrumental, okay, and allowing the board, allowing me and himself to write the journal, write the meeting, okay, and get on a sound financial footing. All of that goes back to him, and I think he deserves all the credit in the world. If there's ever another named award ever given out by the society, I think it should be under David's name. But that's it. The other four people are Stuart Kwan, John Shepard, Larry Epstein, and Nate Watson. Each of these four people were in a position when they had to make decisions that would have changed the course of what happened in that society. And I don't rate anybody. I mean, I put David as it, but these four presidents, okay, I lump them all together, and they just, I don't know, by accident or luck or whatever, were in the position, and they knew it when they got into the rotation as president-elect. So they knew what they were. Each one of them knew what they were getting into when they moved in there, okay? And their performance and their commitment and the amount of time and energy and mental resources that they contributed was above and beyond. Now, as I've said when I started this morning, the Academy's been blessed, okay? There were 21 presidents while I was there, okay? And every single one of them, okay, was a good president. Not one of them should not have been president. Every single one of them deserved to be in the job they were in. They all experienced, different challenges from the Academy, different challenges in their careers, and different challenges in their personal lives. And it's not that they didn't do, and the agenda of the Academy just didn't offer them the opportunity to do what the others were able to do. And so that's the separation. I don't want anybody to think that their contributions, weren't exactly what was needed at the time it was needed. So I don't want to offend anybody with that list, but those are the people that I believe when it was needed, and it was needed when they were just happened to be in office. Okay, people can answer the call or people cannot answer the call. Now, interestingly enough, and this is as true as anything I've told you today. There was not a missed opportunity with the other people, okay? It's just the set of circumstances that came together when they were president that made it. They're all bright. Every one of you is bright, okay? Smart as can be, and is dedicated to sleep. Sleep has had in my term had the greatest commitment of volunteers ever. And I always worried about volunteers because as we became more and more able to, pay speakers and, hire people to be site visitors and reimburse people for this, that, and the other thing, you start to begin to lose, and I can quote other societies about this, but you start to lose what's the value of membership, okay? But with whomever we paid, whatever member we paid to do whatever we paid them to do, okay, they never lost a perspective of what they were doing. It never became a paid position for them. Never, not one time or one person. Okay, was it appreciated? Of course. Was it required for them to? Never. Would they have done it anyway? Absolutely. Okay. I mean, David White never got a penny when he was president. Nothing. Okay, he never asked for anything. He's never asked for anything. But that's neither here nor there. I mean, speakers would have they would have speak if they didn't have any, if regardless they came and spoke, and they got a cab ride and lunch and a night in a hotel room, but they did it for all the right reasons, and they always did it for the right reasons. So the American Academy of Sleep Medicine has been very blessed with 21 of the finest presidents they'll ever have, and like I said in the beginning, and I'll close out with this. They were also blessed with the finest people on the supporting cast that were on the board that never made it to president-elect or on an executive committee. They were just the guys that read hundreds of pages of board material, sat in hour-long meetings, okay, stayed abreast of all the issues, made the hard choices, okay, and didn't ask for anything in return. And that's unheard of, okay? So the organization was blessed that they had that, and I was very blessed that I was able to work with these people. So I hope you all enjoy your 50th anniversary, And I hope that you learned something from today's interview, discussion. And I wish you all the best in the future.